Joe Burrow should win the NFL MVP, except there's just one big problem. Joe's found himself in a scary situation that many highly priced quarterbacks find themselves in. But before we get to that, we have to go back to where it all started. We have to go back before Joe's historic 2024 season and the break-in at his Cincinnati home. Before Burrow's Super Bowl run with the Bengals, his Heisman days at LSU, and the bench-warming days at Ohio State. Let's go back to when Joe Burrow was just a small-town kid, with dreams of playing on the biggest stage. Joe Burrow was born in Ames, Iowa. Yes, Ames, Iowa, on December 10th, 1996, to Father Jim and Mother Robin Burrow. The commonly thought of Ohio kid spent the first several years of his life in Ames, while his father coached high school football after a stint on staff with the Iowa State University football team. The Burrows, unsurprisingly, have a rather healthy athletic lineage. Joe's paternal grandmother set a Mississippi State high school record in basketball, scoring 82 points in a single game. Her husband, Joe's grandfather, played college basketball at Mississippi State. His uncle John played football at Ole Miss, his brothers played football for the Nebraska Cornhuskers, and, of course, his father, Jim, played professionally in both the Canadian Football League and the NFL before turning to coaching. After a few years coaching high school, Jim got a job as a grad assistant with Nebraska, his alma mater, where the Burrows lived for a couple years before moving to North Dakota, when Jim took a job as a defensive coordinator for North Dakota State. After a couple more years in North Dakota, Joe finally moved to Athens, Ohio, when his father took a position with the Ohio University Bobcats, where he stayed as the longest tenured coordinator upon the time of his retirement in 2018. At the time of their move, Joe was 8 years old, but was already lighting it up on the football field as a quarterback, which was peculiar for the Burrow family as all other members were defensive players. Starting in 2011, Joe attended Athens High School, where he started at quarterback for 3 seasons, leading Athens to 3 playoff appearances and their first 7 playoff wins in school history. Joe threw for an astounding 11,416 yards and 157 touchdowns, and added another 2,067 yards and 27 touchdowns on the ground, while starring for the Athens football team. In his senior season, Joe won Ohio Mr. Football and Gatorade Player of the Year, and also starred on the basketball team, earning an All-State nomination in his senior season. During his high school days, Burrow was listed as a 4-star recruit. He was the 8th-ranked dual-threat quarterback in the country. After spending the last decade of his life in Ohio, Joe got the opportunity to live out every Ohio kid's dream, and signed with Ohio State. But after joining Ohio State following his senior season, the coming days in Columbus would be anything but easy for Joe. As a freshman in 2015, for the defending national champions, Joe redshirted, and as a sophomore, found himself buried on the depth chart, behind a very talented list of Ohio State quarterbacks led by JT Barrett. He would become the starter, and transferred to LSU following the spring game in May of 2018. After the spring game, Joe said, "I didn't come here to sit on the bench for 4 years. I know I'm a pretty good quarterback. I want to play somewhere else." Joe had the talent, he had the confidence and swagger, he just needed an opportunity. And at LSU, he got his shot. In Joe's first year at LSU, he won the starting role, and began developing chemistry with a trio of young wide receivers, guys by the name of Terrence Marshall Jr., Justin Jefferson, and Jamar Chase. While Joe finally got his chance, the payoff wasn't immediate, but there were signs. Joe threw for just under 2,900 yards in 2018, adding 16 touchdowns to only 5 interceptions in a 10-3 season for the Tigers, highlighted by a stunning 7 overtime loss to Texas A&M, in which Burrow had to receive IV therapy due to fatigue, and capped off with a win over UCF in the Fiesta Bowl, 40-32.
That should seal the deal for LSU.
Joe also added another 400 yards on the ground, well, 399 to be exact, and 7 rushing touchdowns. The dual threat ability was undoubtedly still there. Joe got his much needed experience. Jefferson was entering his junior year, Chase and Marshall were headed into their sophomore campaigns, and a new face was joining Joe's cast of receiving weapons in 2019, Thaddeus Moss, son of Hall of Fame wide receiver Randy Moss. Along with the talented Edwards-Helaire at running back and a litany of defensive studs, the table was set for Joe's final season of eligibility. Even with the star-studded cast LSU had built under Ed Orgeron, not many foresaw what would come next. But Joe's father, prior to the 2019 season, saw something others may not have, and placed a 200-to-1 bet on his boy to win the Heisman, with a total payout of $400,000. A not-so-insignificant vote of confidence that his son would finally show the college football world his true potential. In 2019, Joe exploded. LSU rattled off 12 wins to cap off a perfect regular season, highlighted by a 471-yard, 4-touchdown game on the road against 9th-ranked Texas, and an incredible performance by Burrow against an unbelievably talented Alabama roster. In the 46-41 shootout victory over the Crimson Tide, Burrow threw for 393 yards and 3 touchdowns, adding several Heisman-worthy moments to his near-perfect 2019 campaign. That season, Joe actually threw one more interception than he did in 2018, finishing the year with 6. He also added 44 more touchdowns, with a total of 60, which, at the time, was an NCAA Division I record, until it was broken by Bailey Zappi 2 years later. Joe threw for 5,671 yards, which led all of college football, and was good enough for 3rd all-time until, again, Bailey Zappi broke the record, pushing Burrow into a tie for 4th. Joe added another 368 yards on the ground, with 5 more touchdowns. Following his incredible performance in the regular season, Joe kept the train rolling down the tracks. Burrow lit it up in the SEC championship game against Georgia, with a 37-10 blowout victory over the Bulldogs, adding another 4 passing touchdowns to his incredible season. The following week, Joe, unsurprisingly, won the Heisman, Maxwell, Walter Camp, Johnny Unitas Golden Arm, Davey O'Brien, Lombardi, and Manning Awards. But most impressive of them all was his performance in the Heisman voting, when he beat out runner-up Jalen Hurts, who was now with Oklahoma, by an astounding 1,846 votes, the largest margin of victory in the history of the Heisman. After all the award-winning, regular season winning, and victory in the SEC championship game, the dust had settled. Joe and the Tigers were 13-0 and headed for the playoff, where they matched up with Jalen Hurts and Oklahoma in the Peach Bowl. How'd the game turn out? Well, probably as you'd expect, given everything Joe and the Tigers had done up to this point. They blew out Oklahoma, 63-28. Joe threw for 7 touchdowns in the first half and finished with 493 total yards, 8 total touchdowns, and he added another touchdown on the ground in the second half. The craziest part about all of this? Burrow did all of it in only 35 minutes of game time, sitting out the remainder of the game to avoid injury. After Joe's incredible semifinal showing, many analysts and fans have since said it was one of the greatest performances in college football history. Justifiably so. Now, the Tigers were in the national title and were matched up against the Tigers of Clemson, the defending national champions who rolled over yet another very talented Alabama team the year prior, 44-16. Many thought this would be LSU's toughest test yet, and were uncertain if LSU would be able to cap off a perfect 15-0 season. Well, Joe and LSU did it again. They jumped all over the defending national champs and won by a final score of 42-25. Joe threw for well over 400 yards again, with 463, and added 6 total touchdowns, 5 through the air. Joe and the 2019 LSU Tigers were perfect. He was the Heisman winner. They were national champions. And Joe's dad, Jim, was $400,000 richer after cashing in on the long shot bet he placed on his son, which, if you ask Jim, was never really a long shot at all. Now, it was draft time. And don't worry, we'll get to the scary truth about Joe shortly. But first we have to cover how his NFL journey has played out so far. After Joe's remarkable 2019 performance, which, to many, appeared to come out of nowhere, Joe was the undisputed top quarterback prospect and a top overall prospect in a talented class that included the likes of Tua Tagovailoa, Justin Herbert, Chase Young, who was one of Joe's old teammates at OSU, CeeDee Lamb, and of course, Joe's good friend, Justin Jefferson. At the Combine, Joe didn't do much other than measure in and interview. He came in at just over 6'3" and 221 pounds. But the main concern with Joe wasn't his measurables or his production, or that he didn't work out at the Combine. It was his hand size. Joe's hands measured in at 9 inches, which is, without question, small for a quarterback, especially of his size, and was a major critique of him in the draft process, causing many scouts to worry about his ball protection at the next level. Nevertheless, Joe was still a top prospect, and with the Ohio kid available and an Ohio team on the clock, the Cincinnati Bengals made Joe Burrow the number 1 overall pick in the 2020 NFL Draft.
The Cincinnati Bengals select Joe Burrow, quarterback, LSU.
In his rookie campaign, Joe Joe definitely showed growing pains, and the Bengals' lack of talent certainly didn't help. Through 10 games, Joe and the Bengals were struggling at 2-6-1. Although Joe did have a tremendous performance in a Week 7 loss against the Browns, throwing for 406 yards, 3 passing touchdowns, and 1 rushing touchdown, becoming the first rookie quarterback in NFL history to do so. And although Joe did everything he could to help the Bengals, it simply wasn't enough, potentially a sign of things to come. In Week 11 against Washington, Joe went down. He was hit low on a play in the second half, tearing his ACL, MCL, and damaging his PCL and meniscus. Joe was placed on injured reserve, was done for the season, and had a long road to recovery ahead of him. In the 2021 offseason, while Joe rehabbed, the Bengals made moves. Heading into the offseason, many felt as though the Bengals should address their offensive line to protect their highly valuable franchise quarterback. But the Bengals went a different direction, and instead of taking tackle Penei Sewell out of Oregon, drafted a superstar wide receiver 5th overall, who Burrow was quite familiar with from his days at LSU. This receiver, of course, was Ja'Marr Chase. Burrow now had Chase paired with another superstar receiver the Bengals took in the second round the year prior, T. Higgins, who played for the Clemson Tiger team Chase and Burrow beat in the national title a short time ago. In 2021, Higgins was ready, Ja'Marr Chase was ready, and Joe Burrow, after successfully completing his rehab, was ready for Week 1. That season, the Bengals finally took a leap forward, and the selection of Chase proved many of the doubters wrong. Burrow threw for 4,600 yards and 34 touchdowns to 14 interceptions, highlighted by an incredible 525-yard passing performance against the Ravens in Week 16 and a 446-yard, 4-touchdown performance in a 34-31 Week 17 win against the Chiefs, and was named Comeback Player of the Year for his efforts. Ja'Marr Chase won Offensive Rookie of the Year, with over 1,400 receiving yards along with 13 touchdowns, and the Bengals finished the regular season at 10-7, which was just enough to win the division. In the playoffs, the 4-seeded Bengals matched up with Derek Carr and the Las Vegas Raiders in the wildcard round, who, hilariously the week prior, beat the Chargers to keep them out of the playoffs, when a tie would have gotten both teams in. But before we get to the wildcard showdown, it's important to note that throughout the year, the Bengals' defense had wavered back and forth, with some strong showings and some not-so-strong ones. In the playoffs, however, the Bengals' defense came to play. Against the Raiders, Burrow threw for 244 yards and 2 touchdowns, winning Game 1, 26-19.
Cincinnati's a playoff winner for the first time since 19.
In the divisional round, the Bengals went on the road and faced off against the top-seeded Tennessee Titans, led by coach Mike Vrabel and superstar running back Derrick Henry. The Bengals' defense kept Henry and the Titans at bay. Burrow threw for 348 yards, despite being sacked 9 times, tying Warren Moon for the most in a playoff game, and the Bengals were headed for the AFC Championship with a 19-16 victory over the Titans, thanks to a last-second, game-winning field goal by rookie kicker Evan McPherson. By the way, those 9 sacks Burrow had taken were the most a quarterback had taken ever in a playoff victory. In the AFC title, NFL fans got a Week 17 rematch, and as the saying goes, it's tough to beat the same team twice. The Bengals and Chiefs clashed again, this time at Arrowhead. The game did not go as anticipated for the Bengals, at least not in the early going, as Road Warrior Cincinnati fell behind 21-3. But in the second half, the Bengals battled back, scoring 24 unanswered to take a 3-point lead thanks to 2 touchdown passes from Burrow. The Chiefs would answer, however, with a field goal of their own, forcing overtime. In the extra frame, the Bengals defense got a much-needed stop, a common theme throughout the 2022 playoffs, when Von Bell intercepted Mahomes on a 3rd and 10. On the ensuing possession, Burrow pushed the ball downfield and into field goal range. And once again, hero Evan McPherson delivered to send the Bengals back to the Super Bowl for the first time since the 80s.
Cincinnati Bengals are the AFC champions.
In the Super Bowl, Burrow and the Bengals matched up with newly acquired Matthew Stafford, Sean McVay, and the Rams. The game was another close one, with the Rams striking early and often, taking a 10-point lead in the second quarter. But Burrow and the Bengals responded with a little over 5 minutes left, thanks to a touchdown pass from not Burrow, but Joe Mixon, to pull the Bengals within 3 at the break. To open up the second half, the Bengals kept the good times and momentum rolling, when Burrow hit T. Higgins on a 75-yard touchdown pass only 12 seconds into the second half, taking a 4-point lead. Both teams would trade field goals in the third quarter, and the Bengals took a 20-16 lead into the fourth. In a highly defensive quarter, the Bengals struggled to get much going offensively, punting on both of their first two possessions. After the second punt, and with about 6 minutes left in the game, Stafford and the Rams embarked on a 15-play, 79-yard drive, capped off by a Cooper Kupp touchdown with a little over a minute left to put the Rams ahead by 3. On the Bengals' final chance to tie or win the game, Burrow hit Chase on a 17-yard pass to start the drive, but shortly after, turned the ball over on downs. And with one knee by Stafford, Burrow's hopes to bring home a Lombardi and a national championship in just 3 seasons came to an end. After the 2022 Super Bowl, Burrow required emergency surgery to remove his appendix in July, just prior to the 2022 season, but was ready for the start of the campaign. In Week 1, however, Burrow was rusty, turning the ball over 5 times in an overtime loss to the Steelers. But Burrow would quickly turn things around, as the Bengals finished 12-4 on the season, with their Week 17 game against the Bills being declared a no contest after the tragic cardiac arrest suffered by Damar Hamlin mid-game. That regular season, Burrow threw for just under 4,500 yards and 35 touchdowns to only 12 interceptions, bettering his ratio from the year prior, and was named to his first Pro Bowl. The Bengals would take home the North Division crown for the second straight season, and matched up with the division rival Ravens in the wild card round. Against Baltimore, Burrow led the Bengals to a close victory, and the following week handled the Bills with ease in the divisional round, setting up a second straight AFC Championship match with Kansas City. This time, however, Kansas City got the better of Joe and the Bengals, as they jumped out to an early 13-3 lead and responded every time the Bengals managed to tie the game, eventually winning on a last-second field goal by Harrison Butker, 23-20. The Chiefs would go on to win the Super Bowl over the Eagles. Just before the start of the 2023 season, Joe inked a new deal with the Bengals and deserved every penny, receiving a 5-year, $275 million contract that made him the highest-paid player in football. After receiving the contract in 2023, Joe and the Bengals took a step back. Joe struggled with several injuries throughout the year, most notably a torn ligament in his throwing wrist. After the injury, Burrow was shut down for the season with the Bengals' record sitting at 5-5 and received surgery to repair the ligament. Jake Browning managed to keep the Bengals above 500 at 9-8, but the record wasn't enough to make the playoffs. Burrow would finish the year with his lowest yardage mark as a pro, thanks to the missed time, and his ability to return from the injury was in serious doubt by many doctors. However, if there's anything we learned about Joe Burrow up until this point, it's to never count him out. This season, Burrow has set the league on fire with his play. He leads the league in passing yards, passing touchdowns, and has only thrown 8 interceptions. He's helped the Bengals battle back from a brutal start to the season, with 5 straight wins after a 4-8 record through 13 weeks. He's even had supermodel house hitters defend his home against break-ins, like Olivia Ponton did just a few weeks back. He's kept the Bengals in games with his playmaking ability, throwing for 300-plus yards in both wins and losses. And to be honest, the Bengals defense has drastically let Joe down, giving up an average of 33.9 points in their losses, including a 44-38 loss to the Steelers, in which Joe threw for 309 yards and 3 touchdowns, a 41-38 overtime loss to the Ravens, where Joe threw for 392 yards and 5 touchdowns, and another 35-34 loss to Baltimore, where Joe had 428 yards, with another 4 touchdowns. With this level of performance, it's easy to wonder why Joe Burrow isn't the MVP frontrunner. Well, here's where the scary truth comes in. Burrow is very highly paid, justifiably so, and it's hard to say if another player is more valuable to their team at this juncture than Joe. Yet, the problem is it's hard to continue to build out a talented roster with a sizable contract Joe has, making the Bengals reliant on continually hitting in the draft, as opposed to keeping some of their homegrown talent on second contracts or adding high-value pieces in free agency. The Bengals defense, as previously mentioned, has taken a large step back since their Super Bowl run in 2021 and their AFC Championship game appearance in 2022. This is due to the loss of many defensive players that the Bengals simply couldn't afford to keep around, like Jesse Bates and DJ Reader. The Bengals drafted Bates' replacement prior to his leaving when they took Daxton Hill in 2022, and drafted a replacement for Reader this past year when they took Chris Jenkins in the second round. This sort of roster building decision makes sense, but requires time. And while Hill and Jenkins may turn out to be fine players, in the short term, they simply don't have the same impact as Bates or Reader. The roster building necessitated by a large quarterback contract, coupled with the historically frugal nature of Bengals owner Mike Brown, and the contract situations of Jamar Chase and T. Higgins still in flux, makes the current Bengals situation highly concerning for many fans. Look, Burrow is tremendous. Statistically, he should be the MVP, and value-wise, he should be the MVP. But the Bengals' middling record in success has largely caused the superstar quarterback to be left out of the discussions, even if he is deserving. Joe has done everything he could to will his team to win, but the sad truth is, one player can only do so much. So, the scary truth about Joe Burrow is that he may continue to play at an MVP caliber for a very, very long time. But without other talented players around him, great team success and the coveted MVP may never come. And while a few highly paid QBs, like Aaron Rodgers and Lamar Jackson, have won multiple MVPs, their organizations are renowned for drafting incredibly well. As far as Lombardis are concerned, well, only one quarterback has ever won a Super Bowl taking up 17% or more of the cap with his contract, and he wears 15 in red. Can Burrow do the same in Cincinnati? Sure, it's definitely possible, but it's become that much more difficult. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Also, if you enjoy football stories like these, click the link in the description to subscribe to our weekly newsletter, where we'll be sharing more football stories and discuss weekly football news in both college and the NFL.